So I'd like to just start off by explaining a little bit about the project that we are working on as a team here. This is a partnership between the Ecological Research as Education Network and the National Ecological Observatory Network. And both of these networks are interested in multi-site distributed ecological experiments where we collect data using a common protocol so that data are comparable across sites. NEON has a highly structured, very large scale effort at the continental scale with a lot of set protocols and particular data products they provide to give a continental ecological perspective. AREN also has the potential to be continental, but we tend to be more grassroots, and we tend to focus on various types of projects that undergraduates can engage in. So we're kind of a smaller scale. We sometimes work at the regional scale or have just a couple of sites partnering. But as we began to enter the pandemic, it occurred to us that we could really use these models, the AREN and NEON models, as ways to develop very useful projects that would allow students to collect data wherever they are, because we're already kind of adapted into a multi-site, sharing data, common protocol kind of model. So we're highlighting 4 different projects. This is, as I said, the second one, titled Plants in the Human Altered Environment. And the way that the webinar will go is I'll introduce our 2 presenters, Jason Kilgore and Karen Coors. Then they will present information about using this, this project in a class. And then we'll have a Q&A. I'd like to invite you to use the chat function to put in any kinds of comments or questions. And Karen or Jason may be able to address your questions kind of midstream by typing into the chat. At the end, I'll read out some questions from the chat so that we can hear verbal answers from Jason and Karen. And I do want to mention that we got funding for this particular grant on July 17th. So less than a month ago. We are still very much developing the tools that we're going to be using all together in our classes. So we definitely invite your collaboration. Please use the chat if you have suggestions or ideas about how to improve upon various projects. So let me take a moment and introduce our 2 speakers. Jason Kilgore is an associate professor of biology and coordinator for the environmental science major at Washington and Jefferson College near Pittsburgh. His background is forest ecology, where he studies plant responses to disturbance, such as fire and invasive species like garlic mustard and emerald ash borer, and life on the margin. He also founded and manages the campus arboretum in his college. Jason participates in several AREN projects and serves on the board. Karen Coors is the Annie B. Snowden Professor of Forestry in the Department of Earth and Environmental Systems at the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee, where she has been teaching since 1994. Karen co-leads AREN's PFPP project, and she served on AREN's board of directors for 3 years. Her academic and research interests focus on the ecology and management of upland hardwood forests and forested urban ecosystems, and she has a special interest in traditional uses of forest and urban plant species for food and medicine. And with that, I will turn it over to Jason.
All right, well, good afternoon, and thanks for joining us today. We're very excited that you're here to learn more about our developing project called Plants in the Human Altered Environment, which we call FAE for short. So our interest is in how we can relate the intensity of alterations in the environment by humans expressed in local units. So those are units where people are living and working and playing, to the importance of woody plants in our environment. So like Lori said, I'm Jason, and I'll be leading most of the presentation today, but my partner, Karen, is going to demonstrate how your students can measure some of those intensities of human impact in the environment. And she'll also be monitoring the chat room during the presentation and trying to address some of your, as Laura said, midstream immediate kinds of questions. And if there's anything that we don't address during the presentation today, all of the chat room questions are going to be recorded or preserved, and we'll be able to get back to you with any of those questions. So please make use of that chat room. All right. So over the next, looks like 52 minutes or less, we're going to give you the reasons why we think that this project is important and how we'll help your students contribute to a better understanding of the importance of the woody plants in our human altered environment. We'll spend a few minutes on some tricky stuff related to measuring these human effects, and then speed over the rather straightforward plant variables, honestly, and then talk about data and end with the Q&A that Lori mentioned. So woody plants provide structure and function to most terrestrial ecosystems. They provide habitat for a myriad of other organisms like birds and mammals, insects, fungi, bacteria, and even protists. They also moderate the climate by insulating against solar radiation and against the loss of that energy from the solar radiation, so against the cold. And you'd know that if you were, say, a chickadee in Maine in January. They also provide other ecosystem services, such as taking up carbon dioxide and sequestering that carbon into woody plant material. They take up water, reduce water runoff from the sites, and they provide a place for those airborne particulates that are causing respiratory problems, a place to land. And it's estimated that woody plants provide over $18 billion annually in these kinds of ecosystem services in the US alone. They also support human health and well-being through things like recreation, relaxation, and aesthetics. However, tree cover in urban areas is declining in most of the US states. In this map from Nowak and Greenfield in 2018, you can see that states with the darker colors have declining urban community tree cover, despite the values of trees in the ecosystem, in the urban environment. So we've not only transformed this environment to our demands, creating this patchwork of fields and roadways and industry and residential pockets and remnant forests, but we've also eliminated most of the tree cover in our urban communities where most of us live and work, despite the values of these plants in our environment. So this leads us to the research question that drives this project. And that is, within geographic regions that are capable of supporting trees, how is the importance of woody plants? And we're defining importance in a variety of ways, such as abundance and diversity, maybe the size of the plants or the ecosystem services that they provide. How is that importance in that environment in which we live, and we're calling them local landscape patches or plots, related to the intensity of the degree to which we've altered that environment, all right? So we predict then that the intensity of the human alteration of the environment is negatively related to the importance of woody plants in landscape patches or in those areas where we're actually living and working and playing. So we're developing this project in the spirit of the ERIN model, the Ecological Research as Education model. This ERIN organization was created with funding by the Research Coordination Network program in NSF, and its mission is to create opportunities for faculty to engage in authentic research that addresses, as Laura said, geographically relevant problems in ecology. So for example, how does tree growth vary across the continent? Or how does earthworm diversity differ above and below the maximum glacial extent line in North America? These are questions that are geographically relevant that we can answer with all of us. So we're leveraging the spatial range of all of us to address geographically relevant questions about trees in our urban or human environment, not just urban. So we're developing this project so that anyone in any area, trees or not, could implement at least some components of this project. This could range from forest plots to campuses, to neighborhoods, to urban areas. So we want to capture the full range of alteration of the environment through this project. We then expect that participants, students, faculty and instructors will be able to compare the data that their students are collecting, not only across groups within their own institution, but across institutions, across the continent, and to sites that are providing data from other kinds of projects. So for example, Erin has this permanent forest plot project, PFPP, where we've engaged in long-term forest monitoring. And we have data from those sites in an online database that we can tap into to compare our students' data to. And we can also compare our data to reference site data from NEON that Lori also mentioned, across 20 eco-climatic domains across the US. So NEON is another NSF-funded initiative that hosts an extensive infrastructure, instrumentation, and data management for long-term monitoring of the environment. There's a wealth of data freely available online. So we're going to provide sample data from NEON sites to serve as comparison points or reference points to your students' analyses. So the idea is that you'll be able to implement this project if your students are face-to-face or mask-to-mask, if they're on campus, if they're completely remote and living elsewhere. So students can work alone, preferably they be working in small groups though. So for example, let's say that if they're working remote, the plot could be nearest to one of the students who's gathering some of the field data, while other students are helping with gathering information using online resources. So in that way, they can work together, collaborate like we scientists do, and address their research question. So we're planning to implement this project in a variety of courses, but Karen and I, from introductory courses for majors to an upper level urban forestry course. I'm also using this project as the lab portion in an economic botany class this fall. So we think that this project could be used across a range of courses, from high school to community college to colleges, with add-ons for analyses that you might think of, additional data sources that we haven't thought about yet, or even modules that you might think would be useful in your class. And we'd love to hear about your ideas and how we can work together to make this a broader and more inclusive project. So there are going to be a couple of different ways, the chat room we've mentioned to hear about some of your ideas, but there's also going to be a participant survey that I'm going to mention at the end of this presentation. So all of the Erin NEON Flexible Learning projects have been posted to the Erin website, which is at erinweb.org, and you can go to this after the presentation. So you can see all 4 of the projects. If you scroll down on that page, the first project that's listed there is our FAY project. And when you get to our page, you're going to find that this is the nexus for all the resources for this project. All of our project resources are going to be linked files or are already linked files that take you to a readable Google Doc or a Google Sheet that is then linked to the project's email account. So everything's going to be linked from this particular Erin website. On that project page, we provide student learning outcomes for our particular project. And so it includes things like teaching students or students learning to recognize the continuum of natural or less human altered to very human altered landscapes. So it's improving their skills in observation, helping them learn to identify study sites using online resources and learning how to classify those landscapes according to different kinds of land cover types and impervious surface areas, etc. Improving their data management skills through both collecting data using standardized variables, but also entering, sharing those data and collaboratively working together in making sure that the data are of high quality going into these Google Sheets, and learning how to analyze data both visually and through simple statistics. So we expect that students, as a consequence of participating in this project, will become familiar with kind of bigger questions in ecology, thinking about bigger meaning geographical questions, so larger geographic spatial scales and temporal scales. So thinking about maybe how does the visual landscape change across the seasons? So these are all kinds of data that we can collect and analyze using this particular project. So at If you follow farther down on the project website, you can see that we wrote 3 short documents that provide sufficient background to understand the project. So they include landscape structure and classification, long-term ecological monitoring, an introduction to it with links to learn more about Erin and Neon, and the development of the research question for this project that we've talked about. Each of the sets of instructions for this project are called modules, and I think of them as digestible modules. There are pieces in there with estimated time, how long it takes to complete each step of the modules, that you could then implement within various lengths of class time. So all of these modules are readable Google Docs, and they list step-by-step guides to doing either the remote or the on-site fieldwork with lots of visuals. And we recommend that students read these documents before going to the field, and then as they can access those instructions while they're in the field, paperless, using their smartphone while they're actually doing the fieldwork. We also, in the next section down, have a data spreadsheet template in the form of a Google Sheet for all of the data. So the data are split currently into 3 sets. There are 3 Google Sheets that are called Site, Plot, and Woody STEM data. So you as the instructor would make a copy of this spreadsheet, then share it with your students within your class so that they can enter their data. After proofing the data, they're verifying data entry, you can then share the data file back to the Erin.Fay Gmail account so we could review and then compile the data into a master Google Sheet that all the contributors will be able to access and use in your class. That means that a student or an instructor at a school in Maine will be able to see data from other states in the US. So the first 2 modules are, you might consider them to be the requisite modules, in that they guide students in selecting a research site, characterizing that site using remote resources, and then going to that site and identifying particular environmental characteristics of that site. So there are both remote and field-based data gathering in these modules. They set up their plot and they characterize those plots features, and Karen's going to tell us more later about how that's going to work. And I just want to show you what some of the modules look like, and some of you may have already jumped off and looked into the web page, but here's an example of the first part of the first module in which students are identifying their study location. So the format across all the modules are similar. You can see that they're all readable Google Docs. They include an estimated time to complete this step or module. They include any necessary background information, not much, usually a couple of the few paragraphs max. And then you can see a link at the bottom of this page to a video that we are planning to use to provide an audio-visual guide. So sitting there, walking them through each of the steps so the student can hit pause in each of the steps to make sure that they're following the module directions. And then within the instructions, we also provide some reflective questions for students to answer related to how they plan to implement each step. So for example, in this, we're asking the students to explicitly state how they will be identifying their study site. So actually to put into words how they plan to do that. You also notice that there's a link for Google Earth there. We focus on using easily accessible and free software from the internet, preferably something that they can use on their smartphone. So last spring, with the retreat from COVID, we found that many students rely much more heavily than expected on institutional computers. And this fall, in spring, they may not have access to these computers given the changes in where they're living. And so we're trying to make everything as smartphone accessible as possible, but can also be used with a computer. So here we introduce students to Google Earth, which is functional on their phones. And we use tools in Google Earth to set up project. They can delineate a study site. They can measure its area using the area tool, and they can measure areas of particular land cover types. Like here I've delineated a managed lawn landscape type or land cover, or landscape bed or paved surface, and then they enter the cumulative amount of area in square meters into the Google Sheet for their study site. So for each type of data, whether site, plot, or woody stems, we have Google Sheets that instructors use for their class. Each spreadsheet has 2 tabs. The tab on the left is the metadata tab, and it lists and defines all the variables, which are also described in the modules. The units are also provided to keep things consistent. So for example, we consistently use decimal degree units for latitude and longitude, because that's easier to relate across sites. That's better because then all the units are going to be the same. So we also provide examples where we think that there could be some confusion. And then the second tab is for the data, which are listed in long format for later data analysis. That is, each of the rows represents 1 time point per subject, whether we're talking about a site, talking about a plot, or a woody stem in this study. And we provide some example data in the orange rows at the top so students can see how their data should look. And so that the data can be linked across the spreadsheets, that is to create relational databases, we're using the key variables called name site to compare study sites. So site is a very important variable to name specific to your study site, and name plot to compare plot data across study sites. So between name site and name plot, we should be able to link all of the data across all of the spreadsheets, thereby creating a relational database for all of us to use. This might be a good place to ask Karen if any questions have popped up that we need to, that we might want to address right now.
No, I think most of the questions have related, are things we could follow up with on the end.
Okay, excellent. That's good to hear. Well, the next 3 modules are focused on gathering data about the individual woody plants that are in the plots. Each of these modules I mentioned is broken into, call them chunks, digestible chunks that can be used in a single class session. For example, in module 3, students improve their spatial connectivity through making a map of the woody stems in their plot. They also enumerate and, if possible, label these stems for reference in later modules. And again, that woody stem number is something that's in the woody stem data sheet that'll be used in future modules. So that's a very important number. And then in module 4, they go back and identify the plants to the appropriate taxonomic level, preferably species, but this depends on your particular needs and abilities in your course. And in module 5, they measure the diameter and classify growth form for the stems. Now note that some of these modules are not required. So one could go and actually measure diameter and classify growth forms without actually having to identify the trees or the shrubs to species level. So there's a bit of mix and match in terms of which modules you wish to implement in your course. Of course, we would love to have plants identified to species, but I know in my non-majors economic botany class, this may be more challenging. So this would also be a good place to mention that all of the methods that we're developing or using in this project are a combination of methods that are developed from the Permanent Forest Plot Project and NEON protocols. And we're doing this so that we can relate the data that your students collect to that which institutions or faculty at institutions associated with PFPP and NEON have also collected. And so there are references to the NEON protocols in the documents, but we take out what we think is most relevant to be used in this particular module and guide the students through how to gather those particular data. But we want the data to be relatable across projects. So as we move into the fall semester, we're going to continue developing these modules related to the analysis of the diversity and size data that we collected in earlier modules. So some analyses can be completed in a spreadsheet, and I'm sure that most of you are able to help your students use spreadsheets like Google Sheet to visualize your data, to do some simple relational kinds of analyses. But we also expect to, as we go through the fall, start developing and posting scripts, R scripts, that you could also use, R being another free downloadable statistical software. So last, this project provides infrastructure for additional modules that are related to ecosystem services like carbon sequestration, water infiltration to ethnobotanical uses of plants in the environment, or to sociological studies of how humans use their environment for other purposes like recreation or food gathering. There can be many different applications of this project once the site and the plot have been defined. So I'd like to put the entire project onto one slide to give you a general workflow here. So first, students need to identify and characterize their research site, which they do remotely. And then they do the same for their plot, which some of it they do remotely and some of it they do in the field at their study site, whether it's an urban environment, downtown, business district, near campus environment, a forest near where they live, a park, or somewhere near their home if they're living at home. And at this stage, students could just take these data and explore how human and other animals use that environment. And that could be the extent to which you implement these modules. Or they can go on to identify the trees or shrubs. They can measure the diameter in those plants. They can measure canopy cover in those plants. And thereby they can obtain data related to diversity and size that can then be analyzed within their sites and across their sites, or even the continent. However, these continental scale comparisons cannot be made if the data are not shared back to the project. So all of us instructors need to share these data back. Even as we complete each stage of the project, it might be helpful for us to see what other people are getting at other sites so that we can use all the data with all of our students. So again, we have data templates that are easily copied, shared with students, and shared back with the project. Also, I want to mention, if you go to the ARIN website, under data, there's very clear policies on how we share data, how we collaborate, and how we contribute to authorship, if any authorship or any manuscripts or papers or posters or talks were to come from this kind of project. So I encourage you to check that out on our ARIN network or on our ARIN website. So at this point, what I'd like to do is share with you how some of these data are collected, starting with the independent variables. That is, the variables that measure characteristics of the plot, of the site and the plot. So for each plot, students can easily gather some of these environmental data from the internet and then take some basic measurements of these variables, or of variables like aspect and slope on the site. However, to measure really the most important independent variable in this study, the level of human alteration of the local environment or the plot area, we have a few ways to do this. I'm going to switch now to Karen so that she can walk you through these procedures.
Okay, I think I am now in control of the screen for a few minutes. And in order to address the impacts of human alterations on the plant community, we have to come up with some metrics of how we're going to quantify that level of intensity of human impact. And so we have included two metrics in the module that we think will be fairly easy for students to be able to measure in a plot, whether they have an instructor with them or they're having to do this on their own. One of those is going to take a look at surface features within the plot itself. And the other metric is looking at the alteration within the viewable landscape surrounding that plot. And that surrounding area can have both a physical impact on the plot. For example, impervious surfaces in the surrounding area might impact what's happening on the plot itself, but also aesthetic impacts that could ultimately impact how that plot is utilized, which in turn would impact plants in the community. So what I've shared with you here is a slide actually of my campus, University of the South, and we have a mixture of levels of human alteration from residential areas, fairly typical of larger landscapes, to ball fields, to residential buildings. We also are blessed with some somewhat undisturbed forest surrounding area. But I envision, for example, this fall utilizing some of the green spaces on campus for my students to be able to establish plots. And I'm going to shift to a slide that focuses on this area right here, which is an example of the kind of place you could install a plot. I've outlined in this green space that's located in front of a residential hall here and actually is across the street from residences. This is the size of a 20 by 20 meter plot. And once the plot is established, you can characterize the impervious surface area within the plot itself. And we outlined two different methods of doing that. One would be a visual estimation approach. Particularly if your plot's fairly homogeneous, it might be pretty easy to say it's 80% impervious or 20% impervious. However, the more heterogeneous your plot is, the more you might find it useful to put in a plot point grid across the plot. Students could put in a 2 by 2 meter grid that's fairly easily paced. That would actually give them 100 points. And at each point, they could calculate or determine if it's pervious or impervious. So there are a variety of approaches depending upon what would work best in the area where the data is being collected. So that's a fairly traditional metric in terms of impervious surface. One that is perhaps a little bit less traditional is taking a look at the proportion of the viewscape surrounding that plot. And that viewscape would be assessed at 10-degree intervals in a 360-degree circle around the center of the plot, in which you'll be looking at, in each of those directions, the proportion that is human-made materials versus the proportion that is more natural materials. And I'll show you as an example here, starting in the center of the plot, facing north, drawing an imaginary line from your feet up to the sky, and then looking along that line for the proportion of it that is representing natural area versus the proportion that is a human-made component. And in this example here, you can see the human-made brick walkway. You can see the grassy area. You can see the human component here of the campus building, and then again, natural area here. And by visual proportion, approximately 40% is human-made along that intersect line from feet to sky. And you would repeat this at 10-degree intervals all the way around plot center and determine an overall assessment, or the average of those 36 assessments, which would be the overall human-made or VH-made impact. And to illustrate how this might be carried out, I went to that very spot that I was showing you as a place I might have the students put in a plot, and I stood in the plot center and I created a 1-minute video going in a 360-degree direction. And I'll throw in now, this might be something that if you have students who are studying remotely, they could use their smartphone to do exactly this. And it is my hope that either on Google Earth or maybe even another mapping program, we would have the ability for people to upload their videos or images from their particular sites for comparison. So as I stood in the center of this plot and began to look in a 360-degree viewscape, then if this was due north, then I would calculate the grass. Then I have human-made right here. I get up to green space here. And I'm going to talk about these utility lines in a minute, but first I'm going to sort of continue my circular path. And You can see at this point here, you'd be looking at almost entirely green space without any of a human-made component, but not too very far around the corner, then we're entering a viewscape that would be primarily, or at least halfway, human-made. And for something like this, we would say that because the building really shows through past the green in front, that I would include something like that as part of the human-made landscape, because it has more of a human-made rather than a natural appearance to it. And as we continue all the way in 360 degrees, again, every 10 degrees, drawing another line, some of those would obviously be almost entirely human-made, and some of those in a very different viewscape would end up being almost entirely a green space. And one of the things I was thinking about as I was doing this would be, well, how might you analyze data like this? If you've got your viewscape patterns in multiple different directions and those are recorded, you could even record how people are using it. If they're going out there and sitting their chair down, do they always face one direction, or the chairs face another, or is there no pattern to that? So that you could assess how people utilize it based upon some of those features. And if we continue on, then I will show you another situation to end up with, and that is here we have again these utility lines, and in my mind and the way we've viewed this, those create a more human kind of viewscape, and therefore you wouldn't have to figure out the percent coverage in between each line. The entire zone that is in essence within the utility lines would fit in the category of more human-made. And within the protocols, we give descriptions of how you might assess different kinds of components. And we're interested in testing how this might vary across landscapes. And ultimately, you could have a combination of both the impervious surface and the viewscape as an overall metric of a human-altered local impact on your plot. And with that, I believe we can shift back to Jason to finish up.
And before we do, Karen, someone asked a good question about how is open sky counted? So for example, on the left side of your screen, you can see that there's a chunk of open sky in there. So what would you do for that situation?
So the metric would say that you draw an imaginary line from your feet up to where it becomes sky. If there are small components of sky in the middle, those would probably be thrown in more to a natural viewscape. It's
a good question that we probably should clarify. It's a good question
that will be more clearly addressed in the protocols than they are right now. I'll leave it at that.
No, that sounds good. Thanks, Karen. All right, so a third method by which you could describe this human alteration of the local landscape is by classifying and measuring land cover types. So you could do this remotely. And within this set of methods, we use this direct method and an indirect method. So in the direct method, students classify their study site by measuring the area with Google Earth of different land cover types in their delineated study area or study site. So for example, here I've delineated canopy cover from one tree. And then we do this for all the trees in that area, and we can sum them to get the total canopy cover for trees in this site for that particular site. And there are other cover types that they would need to measure. So for example, impervious hard surface, managed lawn, cropland rows, because I'm thinking about the range of which, across which students may actually select study sites and plot areas. And so this set of land cover types is a combination of the classic Anderson, not Laurie Anderson, but a different Anderson land cover system, and a more modern national land cover database system. And then the second indirect method is to use that national land cover database system and the viewer to online to select the 30 by 30 meter grid that corresponds to your particular study site's coordinates. And from that, you can get the cover type, percent tree cover, and percent impervious surface area, all of which are interpolated from remotely sensed data. So you can see over on the right side of the screen here, the NLCD land cover type is 22, which corresponds to developed low intensity. The tree canopy for that particular pixel is 0, that's 0% tree cover or tree canopy, and 33% impervious surface. So all of these data would be entered as an interpolated remotely sensed piece of information into the Google Sheets. So while the measurement of the independent variables that we've just been describing may be new or maybe kind of interesting, I think, in the way that Karen has described how we think about the viewshed, that space around us and how much of it is human altered, I think that measuring the dependent variables is a lot more straightforward, and so we won't spend nearly as much time talking about it. But essentially, they're going to map, identify, and measure the diameter for the woody plants in their plots. And we intend in future modules to connect to online apps like iTreeCanopy as we develop additional modules related to ecosystem services that these plants provide. So if we return to our research question with these data, we can then analyze or address the question of how is the intensity of human alteration in the environment, which we are measuring in several different ways in this study, related to the importance of woody plants. So that's in abundance and diversity and size and ecosystem services, or maybe recreational use or food source, in the kinds of spaces where we typically live, that we occupy, where we work and play. So that's why we are limiting ourselves to a 400 meter squared area, which is kind of the space. If you're standing in the center, you look around, and 400 meters squared is kind of the space that humans typically occupy and see. It's also, coincidentally, the area that is used for the NEON protocol and for the ARIN PFBV protocol. So that makes it also helpful. So we look forward to hearing from you, and we've been hearing from you through the chat already, and it seems like we have some really good interest in this. And we hope that you go to our project webpage, and on that page you'll find the instructor participation survey, because we're all surveyed out. But not only do we want to know how you intend to implement this project, so it's a short survey, I promise, but we want to hear from you on what you'd like to see from this project. Maybe you have ideas for modules from which we could all benefit. So something that is really obvious that we haven't seen, or just something unique that you've maybe been working on. An additional bonus to completing this survey is a set of Ginsu knives, that we'll send you links to an update page. So as we continue, after the launch of the project in August 21st. So right now everything is up. So it's like we're exposing the house while we're renovating it. But after August 21st, we will be posting to an updates page any changes in the modules as we go. And then you'll have a link to that page, as well as a link to a document that we're creating called Instructor Tips. So things that we want to, things that we found that have been helpful, either for us or other people have suggested, that we don't want to necessarily put into the module instructions, but may help you as you are implementing this project or certain components of the project. So really appreciate your interest in sticking with us through this webinar. We're very excited about this project and how we can all work together to help our students better grasp how important woody plants are in their environment. And you may notice on the watermark on the back of this slide that it says pilot phase. So Lori mentioned we got this grant on July 17th. We've been working very hard with very short notice to even get to this point. We put together a lot of good materials, I think. And we know that the modules will continue to be refined as we head into the fall. Our goal is to have the first 5 modules to be in, as Karen calls it, user mode by August 21st. And then the next 4 modules we will develop as we prepare for our classes as well this fall. So we have quite a few minutes. Looks like we've got about 10-15 minutes left in our schedule time. So we could take some questions now. We can use the chat room, or we encourage you to email us at the project address of arin.fay@gmail.org. And if you are thinking that you don't have any questions, some questions that we might have for you are, how do you think you might implement FAE into your course? So maybe we can get some informal feedback now, whether it's through the chat room or maybe we'll be able to unmute folks. And then what are challenges or limitations that you see that would that are posed to you for implementing this project in your classes? And third, what else would you like to see associated with this project? So with that, I think I'll end and see where we are. Karen, where are we with the chat room? Do you think we should open this up, or do you think we should try to respond to some questions from the chat room?
I did see a question in the chat early on that might be interesting to address. Someone had asked about, could this project be done in wooded wetland environments or just upland? And they were mentioning one course I would be considering for this is wetland ecology that has a plant focus.
My response is that yes, you can definitely implement this course or implement this project or modules of this project in a wetland system, especially if you have woody plants in that wetland system. Otherwise, you may not get a lot of information. While we're focusing on the research question associated with human alterations of that environment, wetlands have also been altered by humans. So I don't see any reason why this project could not be implemented in wetland environments.
So I saw a question about plot selection, and I thought I would just throw in terms of things to guide the students. The first module actually walks through how they might randomly select a plot center within an area that works for them to be able to measure. And particularly in this day and time, a student needs to be able to get to the place that they're measuring it. And so there might be a range of places that a park, again, a green space, it might be, as Jason mentioned, an urban area. In order to make to randomize that as much as possible, the first module gives an explanation of how to overlay a grid in Google Earth, to use a random numbering system to select one of those lat-long grid points, and then a student could actually either use a smartphone app or a GPS if they had one to navigate to plot center if they were in an urban park or something, to reduce the potential of a biased selection.
I also see a question about particular references. Is there a particular reference you recommend for woody plant identification?
We actually have included in the module both some text that either Jason or I have found useful, but also links to some freely available online apps that they might be able to download to their smartphone. And in terms of identification, we know that that can potentially be challenging for students who haven't had any kind of a plant systematics course. If they have an instructor available, then the instructor may be providing more of that information. But that's where it might be that instead of going to actual identification of the species, they identify it as evergreen, needle leaf, deciduous species, and then they are going to identify a growth form. And in that case, they could actually perform a lot of the analyses even if they couldn't identify an individual stem to species. So we're trying to provide for the potential for all levels of ability when it comes to the identification. Would you add to that, Jason?
Yeah, I would only add that there is a variable called taxon rank that indicates, or taxon level, that indicates the level to which the student was able to identify. So they could go all the way to species, they could go to family, or they could have no entry into that variable. So I think it's as, you don't have to be able to identify the plant, but at least identifying the growth form and if it is a plant that is evergreen or deciduous would be helpful.
There's also a question about incorporating land use legacy. And it says these histories, the question says Northeast Pennsylvania has been beat up, but for different reasons, and these histories seem to affect the vegetation.
I'm writing things down. We don't specifically have something written in at this point that would allow for that kind of more of an in-depth historical look, but I could see that being as a very interesting component to add.
I think in a lot of sites, the land use legacy is difficult to get to. And we found, I think that that is a struggle or a challenge with the permanent forest plot project in Erin. Also in trying to get an estimate of the forest age or the time since last disturbance. So sometimes those data aren't there, but at least the variable does exist so that if the data are there, you can record those data. So I think a land use legacy might be interesting. So if the person who's thinking about land use legacy could email Karen and me at erin.fay@gmail.com, maybe we can have a conversation. You can help us think about how to include a variable related to land use legacy.
Also, I have noticed some really excellent suggestions and crosstalk between participants in the chat. We will be saving the chat and sending that to Jason and Karen so that they can get your feedback. So even if we don't mention it verbally, please feel free to write suggestions, ideas, things you'd like to see in the chat, because we will capture that. And as I said, we are, you know, we're just like you. We're a bunch of faculty trying to figure out how to deal with this very complex fall semester. And we're excited to make this kind of a crowdsource exercise. That's really what Erin and Neon are all about. I do have somebody asking, are you interested in collecting data from outside North America? This person is teaching an introductory ecology course in Karachi, Pakistan, and would like to use the methodology and protocols in FAY as part of the labs in my course. So any issues with that? I'm very excited to hear that.
I think that's great. I think that's great. And there's really is nothing in this project that is limiting us to the United States or to any geographic region, right? Because humans have had their fingerprint on everywhere on this planet. So I think that all of these methods can be used. I don't know how Google Earth coverage is in other places. So but there may be other apps or programs that can provide that kind of coverage that is needed. Yeah, but that would be awesome.
And I just saw a question about impacts of emerald ash borer and how that might play in. We haven't really developed, and I hope we will, a tree health component to this. We've kind of been focusing on the living trees and urban impacts in terms of our initial writing and putting this together, because we kind of assumed that would be where a lot of our students might be collecting data this fall. But being able to incorporate impacts of forest health both in the plot and perhaps immediately surrounding it would be a really neat way to expand this as we move forward.
Someone is also asking, can I get other faculty involved in this who have not participated in CUBES? And the answer is absolutely. We partner with CUBES because they're a great and increasingly familiar platform for people who want to teach with data, and we're definitely all about that. But we are reaching out well beyond CUBES, and we hope that these modules will reach a lot of people, because once again, really the entire world needs socially distanced teaching methods at this particular moment. So we're definitely not restricting ourselves to people who participated in CUBES. We do hope that you'll become an ERIN member. It's free. We are a network of ecologists who like to collaborate, and new projects pop up all the time. We're kind of hoping that that this particular initiative will generate some new project ideas, especially those that will connect with NEON. And actually, a part of this project that we're developing is what we're calling an incubator that will recruit people for a small stipend to develop new project ideas, especially if you're already doing something that's kind of related to the types of projects that we are working with here. Maybe you have an idea that we could help you develop into something collaborative. So we'll be sending out announcements about that quite widely as we continue our work here. Let's see if there's anything else. We've got a couple more minutes. There is a question about would you go into more detail about your plans for above ground body mass of the plants? And this person has mentioned that they wrote some code using R. So any previews? I know that module is still upcoming.
Yes, that module is still in development, and I would love to talk to whoever it is who wrote that. I can see that from later in the group chat. I do see we only have about a minute left, and someone is asking about the other 3 projects, Lori. So could you,
right.
They mentioned that there are 3 projects. Can you talk a little bit about those, please?
Sure. So we've given one webinar about the backyard pollinators, and I am working on getting the recording of that webinar published on our ERIN YouTube channel. So that should be up in the next couple of days. And tomorrow we're going to, at 3 o'clock again, we're going to have a webinar about how to collect mosquito larvae in containers in home environments. Also on Thursday at 10:30 a.m., a different time, just note that, we'll be having a webinar about using lichens as indicators of changes in urban landscapes. And those are the 4 projects that, that we are working to develop quickly in time for the fall semester. And then, as I said, we'll be doing some outreach to recruit people for our incubator projects to get people to develop ideas possibly for spring semester. And I guess we believe as well that these projects are going to be important even beyond the pandemic, that we're going to be teaching in different ways as we come out of the pandemic, and we're going to need these kinds of flexible, more multifaceted, more multi-site approaches. So I think it's definitely worthwhile to develop these types of projects, even if we're not going to be using them this fall. So that's what the incubator is supposed to do. And Tim, my co-administrator, Tim McKay from Colgate, is helping me with project administration. He has put a link to our website that we're, as I said, kind of building on the fly. But also, if you know someone who would like to register for our next 2 webinars, we did put a deadline of August 7th, but we still have some room. So if people would like to register for tomorrow's webinar or Thursdays, please feel free. Please pass the word, and that would be great. And someone said incubator projects focused on plant-based research. Not necessarily. We had the pollinators and the mosquitoes. So, anything that would fit the ERIN NEON merger is really welcome. And basically, we're hoping that the projects we're presenting in these webinars can serve as, I guess, potential models. And so you can kind of see how we're structuring them, what the challenges are, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I'm very sensitive to the fact that I'm sure people have a few things to do. So thank you very much for joining us. And we will be, as I said, convening again tomorrow at 3. And we will keep the chat. So if you have any types of questions, I'll give you another minute or two to add in, but feel free to adjourn. And a quick virtual applause to Jason and Karen. So thank you very much, folks. Really appreciate the work you've done on the module so far. And have a great day, everyone.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Look forward to interacting, hopefully with lots of you.
I'm responding to bunches of texts or in the chat.
Yes, there's quite a few notes people are leaving there. So
Yeah, looks like Bruce Grant is, I'm probably going to talk to Bruce Grant. He asked for my phone number. So
great.
we're going to be doing that. Don't know how this all works. Oh, he's already calling. So I'm going to go. Okay.
Wonderful. Okay.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you. Hold on 1 second, please.
Karen, very nice work.
Thank you. It was nice that Jason was happy to be the lead presenter, and
Okay. Hello.
wow.
This is Jason. Is this Bruce?
Jason, you're still on. Okay, he's muted now.
Anyhow, wow, keeping up with chat, that's tough.
Okay.
Yeah, there was quite a bit of activity on there. So that's
I'll
cool.
download the chat and send it to you, Karen and Jason. And if you want to respond, like if there was something in there that didn't get responded to that you wanted to, you would be able to do that then.
Okay, so we would have their contact information, or
Yeah, where is that, Lori?
Well, I have emails for everyone who's signed up for the webinar. And each of the chat items has the name of the person. So I should be able to provide the contact point or the email if you want to reach out to them in particular.
okay, that'd be great. I'll look through the chat, and if there's someone in particular, then I will email you to ask for their contact information.
Yeah, I think that should work fine. And I will now stop the recording.